The writing process. Ugh. As you may have guessed from the lesson title, I'm not super enthusiastic about talking process. I think this is a lingering frustration from grad school. If you've ever been to a reading, especially one where there are likely to be more than a handful of writers in the room, the question is as inevitable as cops and donuts, turkey on Thanksgiving, or lying in politics. Somebody's going to get up to the microphone, this works better with the microphone, and they're going to ask in a breathy tone, Could you just talk a little about your process? Yes, I mock a little here, and hell, they deserve it. It always struck me as the thing people would ask when they didn't have anything of substance to ask an author. And the haughty answers, dear God. This question always seemed to falsely inflate an ego so profoundly that the answers would come down as if from on high. The microphone would get louder with lots of reverb. A translucent, great, and powerful Oz's head would begin to say almost nothing meaningful. I was always hopeful during that split second between the questions asking and the response that the author would be granted a moment of divine comedic inspiration and decided to elaborately and mercilessly troll the shit out of the audience. Something like, well, first, I fill my beer helmet with 2 bottles of chocolate milk laced with crystal meth. Then I strip butt-ass naked, put on my Donald Duck slippers, throw on a 10-hour loop of ragtime piano, played at 1.5 speed, exactly 64 decibels, and then I just let her rip. Sadly, that never happened. I think my other frustration with this question was that it almost never yielded anything useful. Most writers who aren't rank beginners have already learned what works for them. If I find out that some Pulitzer Prize winner listens to humpback whale sounds in the background as she writes, what do you think the odds are that you'll ever walk in on row hunched over a keyboard in a dimly lit room with a bunch of bleating sea cows mewing in the background? Exactly 0, you guessed it. Authors are individuals with their own preferences and idiosyncrasies. Some really good writers write their first draft with a pen and a paper still. Most work on a computer, somewhere out there. And let's be fair, it's probably Brooklyn. There's a hipster who lugs an old-fashioned typewriter out to his Brooklyn coffee house to make a spectacle of himself as he hammers out his latest pretentious short story. The main point here is that if you're a beginner, you'll have to try a few things until you find a process that works best for you. If you're not a beginner, then you already know your process. If that process involves whale sounds, you're a weirdo. So what? Keep writing nonetheless. For the beginners, though, what usually works is some form of a quiet place with as few distractions as possible. Usually, light instrumental music or no music is preferable. The phone should probably be elsewhere. And you probably want a comfortable chair. These are such basic things that I kind of feel ridiculous saying them. But the key is to find a way to get work done however you can get it done. I've met writers who set an alarm and get up 3 hours early to write in the quiet of the morning. I know night owls too. Do what works for you. We've discussed the abstract tools of the trade and the lessons in this series. However, there are a few concrete tools that you should have on hand as well, especially if you're a relatively new writer. I recommend having internet access handy. There are so many little questions that come up in the course of writing a piece of fiction that you'll never anticipate beforehand. If I'm setting a story in a real city, for instance, I always like to use street names and landmarks that offer a sense of the place, especially if it's an iconic place. I wrote a short story set in New Orleans recently, and using Google Maps to digitally walk the route my character walks was invaluable. It saved me a ton of revision time by ensuring I had my logistics correct. And Wikipedia is insanely useful when little questions come up. You just have to be disciplined with the internet while you're writing. It's not the time for cat videos. Additionally, you should always have access to a thesaurus. It's a huge time saver and a vocabulary builder all in one. Consistent use of a thesaurus will make your diction and your writing mind sharper. For the same reason, it also pays to have a grammar guide nearby if you have a question. This next one also seems a bit obvious to say to an aspiring creative writer, but you need to have an active imagination. You might not be able to help yourself in this regard already. Given that you have interest in writing fiction, odds are good that you already drift into a daydream at the drop of a hat. If you don't, consider this your license to start. Play games with the strangers you encounter. Imagine their lives and homes. What do they do for a living, etc. Beyond this, it's useful to practice empathy. And when I say this, I don't mean that you should empathize in the common way most people think of it, to feel for the other person as a synonym for pity. People don't want or need your pity. Empathizing in this sense is about seeing the world from a different perspective and legitimately trying to understand it. A lot of that means making an effort to understand what's motivating people, asking why they're acting the way they are, and trying to figure out how they tick. I suspect this is becoming more of a lost art, especially as modern politics and culture descend into ideological tribalism. Humans aren't wired to empathize with the position of the other tribe, whatever that tribe may be. It will help a lot to spend time outside your tribe, listening, not judging, and giving other people the benefit of the doubt that they're acting sensibly according to their own personality, culture, and interests. Moral personality and evolutionary psychology are excellent tools for puzzling out the reasons people behave the way they do. But human beings are extraordinarily complex. A human brain is the most complicated thing in the universe. Perhaps this is one of the reasons readers implicitly and explicitly resent stereotypical characters. Flat, real-life stereotypes are rare, thankfully. If you begin with the understanding of your own ignorance, it makes understanding other people at least plausible, especially when dealing with people you don't like. I went to graduate school in a red state. Nearly all my colleagues were religiously blue in their ideological persuasion, and if there were any who weren't, they certainly didn't advertise that fact. I sometimes heard my younger colleagues complaining about the ignorance of their students, which, frankly, I found appalling. I wondered if any of these urban 20-somethings had any idea how much a cow weighed, or the foggiest idea of what it would be like to grow up in a town with fewer than 1,000 people. I learned a lot from my rural students, precisely because I didn't approach them with any preconceived notions of moral, political, or intellectual superiority. Judging other people isn't a novelist's job. Asking questions about them is. There are always a million things you don't know about other people. Start from a position that assumes you're the ignorant one, because you are. Then write. Rant complete. On the first draft, there's really only one prominent school of thought that I've encountered. Get it done. There's a popular essay out there by Anne Lamott titled Shitty First Drafts, and it's almost as ubiquitous as Strunk and White in composition and creative writing classes these days. The gist of Lamott's essay is that one shouldn't fret too much over how good that first draft is, because you can just revise what you've written into a better draft later. The most important thing is just getting it done. She states, "The first draft is the child's draft, where you let it all pour out and then let it romp all over the place, knowing that no one is going to see it and that you can shape it later." Well, hogwash. I understand the sentiment if you're the type of person to let the pressure of trying to write something perfect keep you from writing anything at all. But instead of aiming for a shitty first draft, how about something passable, decent, or dare I even say it, good? Good musicians don't just record a bunch of dissonant noises and edit out the sounds that don't work. Nor do good painters slap swaths of formless colors onto their canvases to be pushed around and reshaped until the messy blobs of paint become something resembling an image. Artists work with intention. If your intention is to vomit a slew of words onto the page and revise them and revise them and revise them until there's something other than vomit, good luck to you. You'll be revising a long time. Why not try to at least adopt the position of an artist from the outset? Do yourself and your readers a favor and begin with intention. A good first draft stands a much better chance of becoming a great book than a shitty one ever will. This isn't to say that all your sentences should be beautiful and your plot fully formed from the get-go, but what Lamott proposes just bugs me. It sounds cowardly, frankly. An artist can no more be a coward than a soldier can if they want to live. Don't be afraid of what you're doing. Embrace it. Strive for Christ's sake. If you don't sit down with the idea that you'll be able to do something good, then you might as well not sit down in the first place. Yes, done is better than perfect, and yes, revision will make something bad mediocre, which you may be able to shape into something good with considerable effort. but try to write the best thing you can write every time you write. And do it with the understanding that future you is going to have to step in and edit that draft into something even better. That's how writing works, and you'll save future you a lot of work if you begin with intention instead of cowardice. Now there are two schools of thought on the first draft. Choose wisely. When you have a draft done, you'll need to do a lot of revision. How much revision depends on what you think needs to be done. Read what you've written, and be as honest as you can be about what you have. If large structural changes need to be made, well, get cracking. I've met very committed writers who finished their first draft and started over from scratch, sometimes multiple times. If that's what you think you need to do, don't delay. Get to work. Personally, I work a lot less intuitively than this. I think for a long time before I start writing the first word. I have a good sense for the big questions in the story, like narrative posture, major plot elements, who my characters are, etc. To do less, to my mind, is akin to trying to build a house without plans. Personally, I'd rather live in a house that someone drew up before they broke ground. But I'm not overly rigid if these plans don't materialize exactly as I'd envisioned. If in the process of writing a story, a plot event that I'd previously thought would work a certain way simply doesn't work, then I won't force the issue. In other words, I won't force a character to act against their nature simply because of a foreordained notion I had about how the plot should unfold. It wouldn't ring true. This is a place to be flexible and give the issue more thought. If things aren't quite ringing true when you read your draft, focus on those spots. Think long and hard about them, and revise. Do whatever you need to do to get that draft to work from start to finish in your eyes. Then, set it down. When you can revise your draft no further after the first pass, you need to forget it as much as you can. Think of this as a cooling off period. And you'll literally be forgetting as much about the story as you can. A month or two is probably a good amount of time. You'll never be able to read your own work with truly innocent eyes because the story did come from you and you were there for every second of its creation. But this cooling off period usually provides enough distance that you'll notice a lot more of the little wrinkles your counterpart in the past overlooked. When you've done everything you can with this draft, read it in a finished form. I recommend some form of e-reader, whether it be a tablet application or an actual e-reader. Find a way to get your document onto a device that formats it like a book. Just when you think you've gotten all your little errors out of your document, you'll learn that you've missed a slew of things that your eyes just scanned right over. For some reason, mistakes pop out more readily from a book than from a computer screen. The closer you can get to book form, the better. I had a 6th printing edition of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood from 1966. And I marked 6 spelling, formatting, and punctuation mistakes that were edited out in later printings. This is just the nature of writing a document with 80,000 words. Even if you're a genius like Capote and 99.9% of those words are correct, that's still what? 80 mistakes? No human is perfect, but the better the tools you use to help you, the better you'll be at catching your imperfections when they arise. Eventually you're going to have to let someone read your work. Remember, writing is a social action, and your readers are the crucial component here. So when you can do no more on your own, give your manuscript to a person or two whose feedback you value. An important point in this part of the process is to learn to not be defensive about your work. This can be very difficult. The reader's experience with your story world is their experience. Listen and learn from it what you can. But also know that this is an individual experience. One of the most frustrating aspects of a workshop can be that the people reviewing your work may not be the audience you're hoping to reach. In my workshops, I had satirists, poets, people who wrote dark transgressive fiction, people who wrote very abstract fiction, horror writers, sci-fi wonks, and even several who wrote literary fiction exclusively. Often the feedback amounted to, "I don't like this," from one corner of the room, which would inevitably prompt a, "Really? I absolutely love that," from the other corner of the room. Then what? The bottom line is that you're going to have to try and get feedback from readers in your target audience. Or, failing that, you could hope to rely on a discerning editor with an eye toward what your intended audience likes. Ultimately, the market will decide exactly what your work is. Until then, you'll only have a vague idea of what you'd like it to be. You're writing a simulation for readers to process. Until they process your work, it's only half complete. Over the years, I've had a few folks, some of them other writers, who've approached me and asked where I get my ideas from. The answer is different for different stories. I suppose the answer is similar to where a great invention comes from. Someone sees a need and then produces something to fill that need. I see a story that should come to life, maybe starting with a character, a scene, or a situation. Art, in almost every form, has a way of presenting the seed of a story idea. So I consume art in many different forms voraciously. Books, films, music, photography, paintings, etc. But I also spend a lot of time reading about the world, whether it's in nonfiction books or newspapers. Newspapers are often great sources for ideas about people. An example headline I showed to one of my classes reads, "Man eats underwear to beat breathalyzer." Real life truly is stranger than fiction, and I mean this. If I wrote that underwear headline into a story and presented it in a workshop, most of the people in the workshop would say they didn't buy it. That would never happen, they'd say. And yet, there is such a man out there, believe it or not. This is one of the tricky things about fiction. Flying monkeys are perfectly reasonable in some story worlds, but real-life things that you've witnessed often strike readers as being over-the-top ridiculous in a realistic story world. The bottom line is that it's the writer's job to make those seemingly unbelievable things believable. You'd have to conjure the type of plausible desperation and faulty logic in a character that readers could see him somehow snipping off and furtively devouring his own underthings right at the moment the cop tapped on his window with the flashlight. "Sir, what the hell's that you're chewing on? Are them your damn tighty-whities? Good Lord." Additionally, I suggest traveling as much as you can and moving to places you know nothing about. Take a sojourn in a place where the culture is different to yours. On the life of the writer, I suggest a few things seriously. First, read a lot. When I was formulating my structural heuristic of plot, I read about 1,000 short stories in 6 months. I probably averaged 5 stories a day, which was about 100 stories every 20 days. Most days I read 8, others I read 4, but I always read with a focus, looking carefully for the inner workings of the plot, the way suspense was initially cued, the constraints and the resolutions. This helped me to understand plot both intuitively and explicitly, and it helped me to understand the aesthetic of the short story immensely. Read a lot, and read a lot of what you're looking to write. You won't become a better writer by reading alone, but you also won't get as good as you can be by just writing. You've got to read good writing too. I'm also going to mention something here that I haven't seen mentioned often in other books about writing. Writers are people, and they tend to be a particular type of people. They're usually introverts, and from this demographic, loneliness, depression, and suicide seem to be overrepresented compared to the general population. There's also a quasi-romanticized myth of the depressed or alcoholic writer, especially among literary writers. There are 2 quotes that I think sum up the mythos of the writer when considered together. The first from Nietzsche, the second from Hemingway. Nietzsche states, "He who fights with monsters should see to it that he himself does not become a monster, and when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." Nietzsche's talking about the type of monsters that haunt a lot of writers, both personal and philosophical. They could be depression, loneliness, or the massive metaphysical questions we deep-thinking writers tend to grapple with endlessly. A lot of writers have the type of personality that just can't stop staring at the damn abyss. And they can't seem to go on about their day the way most normal people seem to be doing effortlessly. That's merely an illusion if you didn't know already. The Hemingway quote is from his Nobel Prize speech, and it seemed to embrace the idea that some form of abyss gazing is part of the job. Writing, at its best, is a lonely life. Organizations for writers palliate the writer's loneliness, but I doubt if they ever improve his writing. He grows in public stature as he sheds his loneliness, and often his work deteriorates. For he does his work alone, and if he is a good enough writer, he must face eternity, or the lack of it, each day. It strikes me that Hemingway is talking about eternity in the same way Nietzsche talks about the abyss, as though somehow the writer must stare at the abyss, let it stare back into him, and if he doesn't, the writing will suffer. And can I say hogwash twice as emphatically as I did to Anne Lamott? I mean, you'd have to in order to drown out Hemingway. He's a sizable literary figure, don't you know? But I must return to one of my earliest premises, that writers don't fully understand what it is they're doing, even the Hemingways. Papa is correct, though, that writers do work alone, but only to an extent. Their ideas spring from the culture they're living in. They're writing for an audience. They have help from editors, colleagues, and friends. There isn't a single book out there that's the sole product of a single human being alone against the infinite. And worshipping this mythical artist against the abyss mentality can be legitimately harmful and even deadly if taken too far. I've lost colleagues and friends to suicide, and I don't know many writers who haven't. Depression is a serious business that affects all too many writers, and this mythos of the artist gives writers, who are already prone to pathological thinking by temperament, an excuse they don't need to wallow in their depression when they should be getting help for it instead. Don't mistake pathology for creativity. Depression will not help with productivity either. I am happiest at my keyboard. It's a lucky trait for a writer. But this isn't the case for everyone who writes. If you're spending too much time alone, take a break, get out, talk to someone. And if you're depressed to the point you can't manage it, get help. You don't need to be on the verge of destruction to create something beautiful. And if your brain is telling you this, that's your pathology talking, not your creativity. A tendency toward depression seems to be correlated with creative minds, but that doesn't mean it's causal. It probably just means that creative types need to keep a closer watch on their mental health than the average person. I have a couple suggestions on this front based on personal experience and psychological research. Even if, scratch that, especially if you're an obsessive writer, you need to remember that your brain is attached to a body. That body needs to be tended to if your brain is going to work to its highest potential. The best thing you can do for brain health is cardiovascular exercise. It doesn't have to be vigorous, and it doesn't even have to be daily, but you should get your heart rate up for 20 minutes or so at least a couple times a week. This is the most effective way to keep your mind sharp. Eat well, too. If you beat up your body and fill it with garbage food and chemical substances, it's unrealistic to expect your brain to be as productive as it could be. Don't fall for the mythos of the suffering writer. It's stupid. Don't turn yourself into a drunken degenerate either. It won't do a thing to make you a better artist, and it'll certainly make you a worse, lonelier, sadder person in the process. And if you're ever suicidal, talk to a professional. Walk into the ER. Don't wait. You can't write any sort of book if you're dead. You owe it to yourself, your family, your friends, and your community to stick around and share your talents with the rest of us. There are so many writers out there who left years, even decades on the table. We've lost many future masterpieces because their putative authors didn't get the help they needed when they needed it. Die at your keyboard when you're 97 instead, with a stack of great novels on the shelf behind you, all with your name on them. Writing is a process of creation. If you strive to create something beautiful, new, or meaningful, you've adopted a noble goal. Thanks for that. You could just as easily have decided to do something destructive. A lot of people do. Have fun creating new worlds and new people. I hope to read about them someday. If you truly love this process, you'll never be a quote-unquote failed writer, whatever that is. I hope my answer to the dreaded process question was slightly more useful to you than speed-laced chocolate milk.